Hello, Year 8. This is the last lesson in the slave trade unit. So to get us started, a little bit of a review quiz. You've got 5 questions here. So you're going to need to go back to your PowerPoints, back to your notes, your task completed, in order to find the answer to these 5 questions. So first of all, in what year was the British slave trade banned? Secondly, what was the name of the politician who campaigned in Parliament for the slave trade to be banned? 3, name 3 different methods used by the abolition campaign. 4, where was the only successful slave rebellion? And 5, which British colony witnessed a major rebellion in 1831 to 32? So again, have a look back through your notes in order to answer those 5 questions. So the title for today's lesson is, what is the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade? So we're going to do a bit of a review of the causes of the abolition of the slave trade. We're also going to look at the long-term impact, the legacy of the slave trade. So you've got 2 words in the bottom corner for your key terms. The first is emancipate. So emancipate is the freedom from slavery. Okay. Compensate means to give money to make up for the loss of something. So the first activity I would like for you to work on has to do with reviewing the causes of the abolition of slavery. So there is a handout on folder that you can print out and you can identify by either shading or by writing in the word to identify which reason the category belongs to. Or if you want, you can write each of the different categories, so religion, economics, politics, attitudes, and then write the reasons under the different category. I will leave it completely up to you how you would like to complete this activity. So read through the 9 reasons as to why there was the abolition of slavery, and then just identify which category the reason belongs to. So for example, if we look at the first one together, slavery wasn't making as much money as it used to. Ship owners found more profitable forms of trade than transporting slaves. So I look over to the side. Is that a religious, an economic, political, or is it an attitude reason why we want to get rid of slavery? Well, it's talking about the idea of profit and money and the fact that slavery wasn't making as much money anymore. So I know that has to do with economics. It's an economic reason to get rid of slavery. So I will shade that box in a certain color, or I'll write economics in that box, or I'll write the reason underneath that category in my book or on a piece of paper. So that's what you need to do. Read through those different reasons and decide which category it belongs to. And yes, some of them may belong to more than one category. You decide. So what about the slave trade from 1807? So remember, the British slave trade had been banned in 1807, but there was still a big fight to be had, and that was to totally abolish slavery and emancipate, so again, to free slaves within the British Empire itself. So Thomas Clarkson continues to lead an abolition campaign, as slave revolts increase in our different British colonies, which is what you would have looked at in the previous lesson. Now, in 1833, the Slavery Abolition Act was passed in Parliament. And what this act did is it abolished slavery in the British Empire. So that freed about 800,000 slaves that were working on plantations across the British Empire. So by 1833, slavery is no longer allowed within the British Empire. Your slaves are freed. Now, obviously, Britain had to sort of provide some type of compensation. And again, compensation is when you are given something. So they compensate slave owners for their, quote, loss of property. Remember, they were going to lose money and profit as a result of slaves being emancipated, slaves being freed. Obviously, they compensate the slave owners, but it's interesting to note that they actually never compensate people who had been slaves. So former slaves are never given anything for their suffering or for their losses as their time as slaves. Okay. Now, there is a video clip here which goes into a lot more depth actually about British slave owners and what and how much they actually received in compensation for the loss of the slave trade itself. It's an interesting clip. I highly recommend that you watch it. It's only about 5 minutes long. But what impact did the transatlantic slave trade have? Because once slaves are emancipated and we get rid of slavery in the British Empire, it doesn't necessarily mean that all the problems attached to the transatlantic slave trade are going to disappear. So take a moment and have a think, what are some of those impacts that the slave trade is going to have, particularly the long-term impacts? So what I would like for you to do is you are essentially going to have a read and you are going to figure out what these long-term impact and consequences of the slave trade are going to be. So the way you can do this is by creating a mind map, or you can create notes. It's completely up to you, but you need to tell me what are some of those long-term impacts of the slave trade. So for example, racism. People were not going to start treating former slaves as equal to the slave owners just because slavery was no longer legal. Okay? Racism is deeply rooted in the slave trade. So have a look at page 124 in the textbook. And again, mind map it, note it, it's completely up to you. What are those long-term impacts and consequences of the slave trade? I'd then like you to read the information on page 125 titled Modern Slavery in the United Kingdom. Because while we're talking about the abolition of slavery in Britain and the British Empire, it doesn't mean that slavery has stopped, full stop, okay? Modern slavery does exist in the UK. So I want you to read that information and answer this question in your books. What similarities and differences are there between transatlantic slavery and modern slavery in Britain? So using your bits of information, what is similar, what is different about slavery during the time of the trade and modern slavery in Britain, okay? You then have a hot and a super hot challenge question. So the hot challenge question is asking you, what is a legacy? So basically, in your own words, I want you to explain what legacy is and try to make a reference or use the example of the slave trade in your explanation. And your super hot challenge, before the abolition campaign, many people simply ignored or accepted slavery. Do you think we, as a society, simply ignore or accept modern slavery? So think about how much you already know or how much you hear in the news about modern slavery. Are we simply ignoring and accepting it, or are we actually doing things to create change? What do you think? Explain that to me. Okay. As always, if you have any questions, please make sure that you email myself or Mr. Marshall. Good luck.